Coming up on Now It's History, a nightmare scenario that could throw the 2024 election into chaos.
20% of all presidential elections have come down to a change in 10,000 votes. That's it. Just 10,000 people, less than a single A minor league stadium. But if no candidate gets that majority, then that calls in a contingent election.
How one presidential elector was chosen by having her name pulled out of a hat.
And so one of these electors said if they went to a party meeting, the member of Congress said, "Who wants to be an elector?" People put their name in a hat. They shook the hat around. They drew the name out of the hat. And that's how that person became a presidential elector.
Why the Electoral College is like a nagging injury that you just can't shake.
Right? You have this nagging injury that you just learn to live with. It's hard to fix it. It takes work to fix it. Maybe you don't have the will to fix it, but you learn how to play your games, whatever it is, with that limp. And I think that both parties can kind of see that themselves. And I think they're a little reluctant to engage in too much change because they're not sure how it might play out if they were to move to a direct popular vote, for instance.
Welcome to episode 2 of Now It's History, the podcast. Hillary Clinton got nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump in 2016. So why didn't she become president of the United States? 4 years later, Trump's backers tried to alter the vote counting process in several states when they sought to invalidate Joe Biden's victory. And in 2024, if the election is as close as the polls say it is, the popular vote winner may not be elected president. When we think of democracy, we assume that whoever gets the most votes wins the election. But it doesn't work exactly that way. In the United States, the real winner is determined by an 18th century contraption called the Electoral College. And to help us understand that, I'm delighted to welcome one of the foremost experts on the Electoral College to Now It's History. Robert Alexander knows his subject matter inside out. I got to know Rob when I was editing CNN's opinion section as we covered the 2020 election. He was our go-to source for figuring out how this rickety, unloved part of the U.S. Constitution determines who gets to become the most powerful person in the world. Robert Alexander is a professor of political science, and he's the founding director of the Bowling Green State University Democracy and Public Policy Research Network. He is the author of the definitive study, Representation and the Electoral College, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. His research on electors was cited during arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court in 2020, and he has appeared as an expert on the Electoral College throughout the media. Robert, thanks for joining me to help us make sense of this all-important institution.
I'm delighted to be here, Rich. Thanks for having me.
Great. I wanted to start out by asking how you became a student of the Electoral College.
When I was in graduate school, I had a professor approach me and he said, "We know nothing about presidential electors. It would be a really interesting short study on who serve as these kind of anonymous individuals that nobody knows anything about." And I said, "Sure, let's do that." At the time, you always say yes whenever your professor asks you to do a research project. So I said, sure. And he thought it would be a nice footnote in American government textbooks. Well, some time passed and he left the University of Tennessee, which is where I was at, and that project died with him. This was prior to the 2000 election. I really wish we would have followed through with that project at that time. When I landed at Ohio Northern University as a professor of political science in the early 2000s, I decided to work with my students on a project that they could all kind of wrap their hands around. And so we were able to do a survey of presidential electors from the 2000 Electoral College. And really, the idea was to just get the demographics. Who are these people? Pin a face on the Electoral College. What we found was that, of course, they don't look like most Americans. They are indeed really strong partisans and all of that kind of stuff. But what was really interesting is we asked a couple of questions based on some public opinion polls that we had seen. And recall for the listeners that the 2000 election, of course, was very divisive. We had a misfire election where the popular vote winner was not the Electoral College winner. It was also razor thin. George W. Bush won by 2 Electoral College votes with 271. And we asked this 2 questions. One, do you believe that George W. Bush was elected legitimately? And then a second question, do you believe that Florida's recount hurt his legitimacy? And those were just 2 questions that we wanted to compare to the general electorate. And again, these are electors in the Electoral College. And the responses that we got, probably no surprise. Democrats thought that Bush was not elected legitimately. And 99% of Republicans thought that, yes, Bush was elected legitimately. Now, that 99% seems like a lot, and it is, right? But it wasn't 100%. And we go back and we say, well, he won by 2 electoral votes. There are real human beings casting those ballots in December after you and I vote. And so it turns out that there were 4 of these respondents. 2 said that no, Bush was not elected legitimately, and 2 said that they were uncertain. So that told me that there were at least some members of the Electoral College among Republicans that were uneasy casting their votes for George W. Bush. 2 of those electors were from that contested state of Florida. Moreover, what I found was that there were a lot of electors that actually put handwritten notes on their surveys. And generally, as a social scientist, if you receive 15% of your surveys back, you're pretty excited about that. We ended up getting like 63% of the Electoral College responding to our survey. So they really wanted to talk about their experiences. And many of them wrote handwritten notes. Among them were folks that said, I will never serve as an elector again. I received death threats due to my experience in the Electoral College. I received email viruses due to my experience in the Electoral College. And that was new information to me. So what started out as this kind of little pet project to kind of pin a face on electors turned into something different. And so I knew that 4 years later, I was going to ask the survey questions again. But in the next survey of 2004 Electoral College, I asked them whether or not anybody had contacted them to change their vote, because I hadn't seen anything really on that ever in the literature. And then I asked a second question as to whether or not they gave any consideration to changing their vote. I thought that was such a remote possibility with the first survey. Of course, I didn't ask that question. So in 2004, we found that there indeed was an audience among electors that did consider changing their Electoral College vote from what was expected. Those people turn out to be called faithless electors. And there were a significant number of electors that were lobbied in 2004. And most of those were lobbied in the decisive state of Ohio in 2004. So those 2 surveys then set me on a path to say, I need to do this every 4 years because there's a lot going on underneath the surface that scholars and certainly citizens don't know a great deal about.
Let's take a step back and explain for our audience, what exactly is the Electoral College?
That's a great question because so many people know that we have it, but they don't really understand it. It's a little bit like the weather, or maybe the college football, playoff system. People have an idea of what it is, but they don't know exactly how it operates. Which, by the way, if I were kind of, thinking about this from a larger perspective, that's probably not a good thing in the United States, right? Like, you should at least understand the system that we use to select the nation's highest positions of president and vice president. But many Americans don't know a lot about the Electoral College. But what it is really is a system where it's an indirect election of the president and vice president. It's a state by state contest. And so this kind of gets that idea of why do we have swing states and battleground states and these kinds of things. So obviously we don't have a national election, but we have essentially 51 state by state elections. All states decide them by the popular vote in that state, but most all states award their electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis, which means if you win a state by 1 vote, you get 100% of the electoral votes in that state. Maine and Nebraska use the district system to award or allocate their electoral votes. which means that whoever wins the popular vote in that state gets 2 electoral votes for their bonus 2 votes for having senators. And then whoever wins each congressional district also gets an electoral college vote. Now, I'm kind of talking about Senate, House. There are 538 electoral votes altogether, and that corresponds to the representation that each state has in the House and the Senate. The House, of course, determined by the amount of population that a state has. So more populated states have more electoral college votes based upon their House representation. But all states, regardless of their population, get 2 electoral votes based upon their Senate representation. And that, of course, provides a little bit more leverage to less populated states relative to their population in the Electoral College. You need to receive 270 of those 538 Electoral College votes, which is a majority, to win and become the president and vice president of the United States.
And who are these electors?
They are strong partisans. They are chosen by their political parties. Again, this was a really interesting road that I went down when I was trying to figure out who these electors were. Their names are published. Most often, they are not published on your ballot, so you don't know who you're voting for, who are supposed to then vote for. But the parties choose them. Essentially, each party determines who their electors are. Could be at a state convention, so you may run for the office of presidential elector, or you may have a party committee choose who your electors are going to be in your state. California, this was one that I found fascinating. Democrats, I found out when I did the first survey, I had somebody write back and they said, I'd love to tell you how I became an elector in California. And in California, the Democrats, they allow their House members to choose directly who electors will be from their congressional district. And so one of these electors said if they went to a party meeting, the member of Congress said, who wants to be an elector? People put their name in a hat. They shook the hat around. They drew the name out of the hat. And that's how that person became a presidential elector. So the world's oldest mass democracy, it's fascinating to kind of see how some of these things play out. But every once in a while, these electors, as I said, very strong partisans. Many of them give money to the political parties. But maybe not all of them might not be tied to a specific candidate per se. You can be a strong Democrat and not necessarily be a Hillary Clinton person. You might have been a Bernie Sanders person. You can be a strong Republican and not be a Donald Trump person. You might be more of a John Kasich person. So there is variation among those electors when you kind of take a look at them more closely. And again, they really run the gamut. Some of them are ordinary Americans that are just really active in their parties. A quick story, the first group of electors, I actually invited them to campus back in 2004. And I asked for them to provide me their resumes. And one elector from Ohio, she put homemaker. She just saw herself as just a good, strong, loyal Republican who won the office there and didn't see herself as anything other than. So how they see themselves, very different from individual to individual. Electors run the gamut.
So what happens after the popular vote in November? When do the electors cast their ballots?
So when you and I vote, we're essentially impaneling however many electors belong to our state to then go and vote in their state capitals about 4 weeks after you and I vote. So in mid-December or toward the end of December, what you will find then is that these electors, they gather together in their own state capitals. And this is actually something that the framers discussed in the Federalist Papers. They thought that having these electors cast their ballots in their own states and not in one place would prevent cabal and intrigue, which is, of course, very interesting given some of the findings that I've had. But you go and you cast your ballot in your own state. Usually there's pomp and circumstance around it. You talk about the importance of democracy and all the trappings of state capitals. And many of these electors ultimately are asked to go maybe to the presidential inauguration as well. But they cast their ballots, usually without any issue. Recent elections, we've seen some lobbying, we've seen protests and all of the like. But they cast their ballots in their state capitals. Governor signs off on those certificates of ascertainment is what they're referred to. They then are sent to the House, to the sitting federal judge, to then be counted on January 6th. And January 6th, of course, today, everybody knows that date, but it's also been a date that was set for Congress to count those votes for many, many years. But now it's, of course, corresponds with the events of January 6, 2021. So, yeah, that's pretty much the process.
Why should we pay attention to the Electoral College in 2024?
It's really interesting. So I think about my graduate school days, and we spent very little time discussing the Electoral College. And I don't think I was alone during that time period. And yet, as I started to study the Electoral College, you realize that everything in the presidential race comes back to the Electoral College. Not only where campaigns visit, and so right now in 2024, you're seeing the campaigns essentially cluster in 7 states, and the 2nd congressional district in Nebraska, which is also quite valuable in this election. And so all of that campaigning goes in the direction of those swing states, but you also find not only the money, but the policies that they're talking about often cater to some of the issues that are important in some of those swing states as well. So we are finding historically that the Electoral College and the popular vote margin generally does not align very well. So generally what we find, because of that winner take all that I discussed briefly, because you award 100% of the votes regardless of what the outcome is in a state, if you win by 1 vote, that magnifies or amplifies an Electoral College victory for those that win the popular vote. And so, for instance, Bill Clinton gets 43% of the vote in 1992, but like 68% of the Electoral College vote. What we are now finding, however, is that in this election, we are likely to see those align pretty well. So all of the public opinion polls are showing us that we're probably going to see a very tight race in the polls, but that tight race will also translate to a tight race in the Electoral College. And so every vote will be just very, very important going down this home stretch. And there are indeed some scenarios where it's not out of the question, where you might be right around that 270 vote threshold to get a majority in the Electoral College. So as you kind of look through what is occurring, it is very valuable to kind of shore up every single Electoral College vote that you can get in this 2024 campaign, because there's only so many paths to that majority in this election.
Robert, you co-authored a really interesting and scary piece in The Hill about the nightmare scenario where the Electoral College vote is actually a tie. Could you explain how that could happen?
Yes. And I should point out that, that example that I gave about Clinton really underscores just how close almost all presidential races tend to be. Half of all presidential elections come down to a change in 75,000 votes or less across the country. We can look at 20% of all presidential elections have come down to a change in 10,000 votes across the country. That's it. Just 10,000 people, less than a single A minor league stadium. And of course, we've found a good number of presidential elections already, nearly 10%, where we have these misfire elections, right? So that you have this deviation in popular Electoral College winner. So the point that I'm making is that these elections tend to be much closer than we anticipate. And we almost had an Electoral College tie in 2020. I think one state had to go a different way. And so essentially, if you have pretty much Harris winning her blue wall states and then Trump taking all of the South, North Carolina, Georgia, and then those Sunbelt states out west, and Harris, that would take it all down to that 2nd congressional district in Nebraska. She would need that to hit 270. If Trump were to get that congressional district, which is not out of the realm of possibility, he'd be right at 269. And if that were the case, and there's another scenario where you can get to 269 that's pretty reasonable as well. But if no candidate gets that majority, then that calls in a contingent election. And I've learned that nothing is out of the realm of possibility. I've learned that even the wildest scenarios, because I tend to be trying to keep things pretty calm But I've learned now, especially after the 2020 election, that almost anything is possible. And if we had a contingent election, the choice of the president would fall to the House of Representatives. But it would fall to the new House of Representatives that would take office January 3rd. That new House of Representatives, it would not be a person by person vote, but it would be state delegation by state delegation vote. And so Wyoming, with its one member of the House of Representatives, would have the same amount of power as California, right? So each of those state delegations is equal to one another. And the likelihood that Democrats would control, a majority of state delegations, probably not real high, although Democrats could control the numbers of people in the House of Representatives. So that too could be a very interesting thing to observe. And then what's fascinating is that the choice of vice president would fall to the Senate and that new Senate. And so depending on what the composition of the Senate ends up being, it's conceivable that Democrats could maintain the Senate. Republicans could have that House advantage, and you could have Republicans choose a Donald Trump president and Democrats in the Senate choose a Tim Walz vice president. There are all kinds of crazy scenarios out there. And again, I wouldn't put anything off the table, and I'm not typically an alarmist. In fact, back in 2020, when I was writing articles for you at CNN, I tried to kind of be that voice of reason to say, there's going to be a lot of talk about undoing what happened in the November election on January 6th, but it is unlikely to happen because of the Electoral Count Act and because we have rules and because we have laws. And yet I did not foresee the lengths that the Trump campaign and others would go to interfere in, even determining who those electors are, including appeals to state legislatures to impanel their own electors back in 2020. So yeah, that is a nightmare scenario where no candidate receives a majority of the Electoral College votes. And it's certainly more than a 0% probability.
Thanks. Let's look back at 2016. What happened that year?
So 2016, and when I was doing my research on electors, one of the things that I have found is that there is indeed an audience among electors who I call them wavering electors. About 10% in every election consider not voting for the candidate of their party's choice. And that can be for a host of reasons. And we've had faithless electors in the past. Well, that idea of faithless electors was seized upon in the 2016 election by this group calling themselves the Hamilton electors. And so in 2016, Donald Trump, surprise victory, Hillary Clinton, 3 million more votes than Trump across the country. Indeed, there were even electors, Republican electors, as far back as August of that year that said that they would not vote for Donald Trump. They could not vote for Trump. It would be against their conscience. And so there was already a little bit of a revolt among some Republican electors, but you were also seeing it even among some Democrat electors that thought that Hillary Clinton was too corporatist for the Democratic Party and really wanted Bernie Sanders. So there was a lot. Again, you find a whole group of different types of people in that process. In 2016, in that home stretch, in that interregnum period between when you and I vote in November to when the Electoral College voted in December, you saw a massive public display and appeals to electors to use their judgment to kind of call upon the framers' original vision of the Electoral College, where electors would be these wise, judicious, learned folks that would do what would be right for the country and not their party or their state or their region. And they were drawing upon Alexander Hamilton, which at the time was enjoying quite a good time on Broadway, Hamilton. And they were drawing upon the Federalist Papers, and Hamilton writes about such things. He warned of foreign interference in elections. Those electors back in December of 2016 actually requested a briefing from the National Security Administration to find out what information was out there about Russian interference in the election. Barack Obama said, we're not going to have that. And so it's very interesting. They really were trying to draw upon that. This was a letter to the New York Times, from the New York Times, by one of those Republican electors soliciting other faithless electors to put country over party to do the right thing. They needed about 36 Republicans to either abstain or to vote for somebody else. Ultimately, there were 10 electors in 2016 that tried to vote faithlessly. 7 of them were successful, 3 were not. 2 of them were Republicans, so not very many Republicans joined the team of the faithless electors. But when we did our survey of electors in the following spring, no surprise, the response rate of that survey was lower. I mean, the temperature around the 2016 election was very divisive, obviously. But we found around 20% of Republican electors that gave some consideration to not voting for Donald Trump back when they voted in December of 2016, which would have been far more than what they needed to actually throw it into the House of Representatives for somebody else to choose. And I want to point out that those electors were not saying that they thought that Hillary Clinton should be president. They were actually calling for a compromise candidate to unite the country. They were trying to say Colin Powell, for example, would have been a good example for them, or a John Kasich or a Mitt Romney. So they were trying to find somebody who would be a bridge between the two parties to do so. They were ultimately not successful. It spurred a Supreme Court case about the fidelity of electors. Can electors actually do what they want to do? Because then again, as we pointed out at the outset, a lot of Americans don't know that much about the Electoral College, and many Americans already don't have a lot of faith in our system. To find out that somebody can cast a vote for Faith Spotted Eagle in the state of Washington and not for Hillary Clinton rubbed many people the wrong way. And the Supreme Court ultimately determined that if a state wants to prohibit a faithless elector, they can do so. And so, on one sense, I don't want to say put an end to the speculation about faithless electors, because that also means that states have to adopt laws to prohibit and cancel those votes. And we have over 300 electoral votes right now that can be canceled based upon voting faithlessly. But that still means we have around 40% of votes right now that a state may have a law that prohibits it, but they have no mechanism to deal with it. And then there's another 100 Electoral College votes that there's no legislation at all on faithless votes. So on the one hand, it sounds like, oh, we're done worrying about faithless votes. That's not true. And again, kind of coming back to that nightmare scenario, we come down to 270 Electoral College votes for one candidate over another. The amount of inducement and the amount of kinds of things that could be thrown at somebody to encourage them to change their vote in one direction or another would be monumental. So to have that much pressure placed upon these anonymous individuals would be quite something. So if I could wave my magic wand and changing something about the Electoral College, to me, that's an easy fix, is to have every state adopt some kind of legislation that would prohibit and cancel faithless votes, to at least take that guesswork out of a process that people don't understand to begin with.
Very interesting. And now we're going to take a brief break from our chat with Robert Alexander for a quick quiz. I'm going to pose 3 questions based on recent posts at www.nowitshistory.com. Question 1. In the movie Civil War, which 2 states joined together to fight a dictatorial U.S. president? 2. What parallel was there between the 2020 election and the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln? 3. The rise of alternate energy sources like wind and solar power is pushing wholesale prices for electricity to zero in some places. What countries are seeing this happen? I'm going to reveal the answers to those 3 questions at the end of the podcast. Robert, how did the Electoral College come to be?
So the framers, when they came together in Philadelphia, it really came out late in the process. The odds-on favorite for much of the convention was that Congress would select the president and vice president. After some conversation, after some debate, they realized, this could be a separation of powers problem for us. We don't want to have too much control over the executive branch. So then the question of, well, what about state legislatures? maybe state legislatures to choose. So embracing federalism and allowing state legislatures to choose who the president, vice president would be. They said, well, that might lead to too much regionalism, too much localism. There was also the question, well, what about direct election? What about direct election of the president? And not surprisingly, the same arguments that we hear today about direct election occurred back then too. Well, Massachusetts and New York would have too much power. The most populated states would have too much power over the less populated states. A second issue with that also was that perhaps then Americans wouldn't have enough knowledge and information about candidates to make informed decisions. George Mason said it would be like giving a trial of colors to a blind man to allow citizens to make that decision. So it wasn't as though they were against direct election in principle, but they didn't know how to practice it. So ultimately, late in the convention process, in this committee, which is one of my favorite committee names, every company organization should have a committee, the Committee on Unfinished Parts. They got together and they said, okay, what are we going to do with this? And they basically put all three of these processes together. And it's a Frankenstein's monster of sorts, where you have this indirect election of the people, states having some authority here. Much of it also came around the Connecticut Compromise, where that kind of representation of combining the House and the Senate together to make sure that lesser populated states had their representation via the Senate, but the populated states also had representation via the House. And then there are some scholars that also take a look at the 3/5 compromise and say that that had a part to play in it as well, because that 3/5 compromise that said that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a human being for census purposes created a bit of a coalition among less populated states and slaveholding states for that 2 Senate bonus part of the Electoral College plan. So some of the roots are even found there. So this Committee of Unfinished Parts comes together. They create this body. Many of the framers thought that really the Electoral College would really be a nominating body. It wouldn't be something that would actually choose the president and vice president, but would ultimately create contingent elections, because there wouldn't be too many characters across the country that would command a majority of those Electoral College votes. So they thought, in a way, that 19 times out of 20, this is one of the quotes that one of the framers had, the House would ultimately make that decision of who the president and vice president would be. And so, and another piece that I want to kind of make clear, two things, is that they really did want to have somebody who would be a national political figure. They really did want to guard against that regionalism or localism. And so they wanted somebody that kind of focused on the country, not just a state or a region. And the second thing that I think is really important is when folks say, well, the framers in the Electoral College, the framers, which framer? It depends on which framer we're talking about. It depends on the day. James Madison went back and forth on how he felt about direct election of the president of the United States. And so it really was born of compromise. They had lots of competing interests that they were trying to deal with at the time. And most folks that have paid some attention to American history realize that they were also politicians. Yes, they had a lot of bright ideas. They didn't knock them all out of the park. Kind of thinking back to the original conception of an elector, they thought these electors would be the wisest people that could make decisions. Most of those early electors were chosen either by their state legislatures or by popular vote. And the idea was that these electors would then choose who they thought should be president and vice president. Originally, there was no distinction. They cast 2 votes, and whoever had the most votes would become president. Whoever would get the second most votes would become vice president. They did not foresee the emergence of political party tickets. And so by the 1800 election, when you have Burr and Jefferson running together, you have this party ticket. The electors that were obligated to them voted 1 vote for Burr, 1 vote for Jefferson. They tied. Therefore, no majority in the Electoral College. 36 votes, 36 ballots in the House of Representatives before Jefferson ultimately emerges as president. So clearly there was a major flaw in this original Electoral College. So by 1804, the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is passed, and what that did was it separated the votes for president and vice president. that alone really solidified the importance of political parties to the process. It solidified them. It also encouraged that winner take all to discourage third parties from the process as well. And so when we think about the framers and the Electoral College, that original Electoral College is not what we have today. That's a bygone era. And by 1804, that 12th Amendment Electoral College is much closer to what we have today than what the framers originally envisioned.
What do you think is the best argument in favor of the Electoral College?
Well, when I first started studying the Electoral College, I honestly did not think a great deal too much about the arguments around it. I think that the idea of federalism is certainly one that many people will bang the drum on. And the more I've studied it, the harder it is to kind of defend or I guess even highlight the good things about it. So when you're talking about federalism, well, without the Electoral College, campaigns would ignore lesser populated states. The reality is they already ignore lesser populated states. They spend very little time in lesser populated states. So if that's the argument for the Electoral College, it's not a great argument. One of the arguments used to be the Electoral College discourages fraud because it isolates fraud. It'd be too hard to oversee fraud in a national election. Well, I think one of the things that we've seen is that it might make fraud or it might make interference in an election or leveraging in some way, manipulating. I want to be careful with those words, but manipulating easier because you only have to focus on so many states. And so it's fascinating. One state can have certain rules over voter accessibility. Some might call it accessibility. Others might call it suppression. So how one state encourages voting or maybe makes voting a little bit harder can ultimately determine the outcome of a presidential election. 2016, for instance, that the Russian interference that occurred in places like Facebook targeted swing states, right? They didn't target the entire country. And so the argument that it discourages fraud, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe one thing that you definitely see as an argument for the Electoral College is that it does preserve the two-party system. And political scientists have generally been pretty good on the two-party system, generally speaking. In recent years, however, the two-party system has resulted in a situation like we're seeing right now. So you asked earlier about the 2024 election and why should we pay attention to the Electoral College? And I'm saying, just like many others are saying, we're likely to see a very close election. But this close election will have huge consequences if one party is selected or another party is selected, right? So that binary idea, the poles of the parties are getting further away from one another. And yet I look at it as we have polarized choices where a lot of Americans might not be so polarized themselves, right? So that argument for the two-party system has always been kind of a benefit to the Electoral College as well. So I'm answering your question of like, what's the biggest benefit of the Electoral College? I'm kind of saying, well, here are some problems with it. Maybe one of the benefits is we know what the system is. And I've heard it described one way as it's like you're living with a nagging injury, right? You have this nagging injury that you just learn to live with. It's hard to fix it. It takes work to fix it. Maybe you don't have the will to fix it, but you learn how to play your games, whatever it is, with that limp. And I think that both parties can kind of see that themselves. And I think they're a little reluctant to engage in too much change because they're not sure how it might play out if they were to move to a direct popular vote, for instance. So it's the devil that we know. And I think both parties can kind of recognize that. And it's the game that you play.
Great. How does the Electoral College affect the value of a vote in, for example, Wyoming versus California?
So because of that 2-seat bonus that every state gets, rural states, less populated states have more electoral leverage relative to their population. So in Wyoming, one Electoral College vote is equal to around 200,000 people, whereas one Electoral College vote in California is equal to 700,000 to 800,000 people. So from that perspective, it would make that singular vote in Wyoming more valuable than that one vote in California. From that perspective, it can trouble some, kind of one person, one vote, equality. Another way to even think about this is that who's really advantaged by the Electoral College is I would make the argument it's where they're spending their time and who they're campaigning to. So in my view, it's the swing states that are truly advantaged by the Electoral College. So I'm coming to you from Ohio. We had been the prize jewel from 1960 forward. Hard to go through the presidency without winning Ohio. And we've lost that swing state status, at least for now, right? So we're not seeing any visits from presidential campaigns. There's no campaign. There's nobody trying to earn your vote. And so those battleground states right now are the ones that the campaigns are trying to woo. And as they're trying to woo those folks, it's through campaign promises too. Maybe one thing to kind of step back from that is at the same time, our politics have also become very nationalized. It's hard to kind of see yourself as an Ohioan or a New Yorker. I mean, we really are seeing ourselves tribally as Democrats and Republicans. And so from that perspective, maybe some of the arguments, at least today, might be overblown about the amount of power that one state gets versus another state based upon the Electoral College, because our politics is so nationalized on the basis of political parties.
What happened in 1877?
So the 1876 election, we have this election where Hayes Tilden wins the popular vote. So it's another one of these misfire elections. Tilden wins the popular vote, but loses. In the Electoral College, it was coming down to one vote. I believe there were 3 states that were disputed. And I think they sent multiple electors, electoral slates, to Congress to be counted. And there was also, I think, a question in Oregon about a singular elector. And again, it came down to one vote. So this one elector in Oregon, who I think was a federal office holder, there was questions because that's the one thing that you can't be as an elector is a federal office holder. So there were questions about that as well. Well, at the end of the day, you can have laws, but you need people to judge those laws and interpret those laws. And the idea of this disputed election, there was a lot of gray area. Ultimately, there was a compromise reached. I should go back. There was actually a commission that was put together, but the jig was up when we found that on that commission, there was one more Hayes supporter than there was Tilden supporter. So at that point, you knew what the outcome was likely to be. I should kind of point out that in 2020, Ted Cruz was saying, hey, we should go back to this 1877 commission idea, which was a debacle, because what it ultimately did is you had this agreement to remove troops from the South as a result of this compromise in 1877 to bring Hayes into office. By 1887, so 10 years later, Congress, it took them 10 years to come together to say, we want to prevent another disputed election like this. So they developed what's called the Electoral Count Act of 1887. The Electoral Count Act provided a means to resolve a disputed election by kind of outlining what the state's roles would be in a disputed election and what Congress's role would be in a disputed election. Rarely invoked. I spent a couple of paragraphs writing about it in my book, Representation in Electoral College, and then it became the bee's knees in 2020. Everybody was looking at Electoral Count Act because there were still vagaries around it and the ambiguity that we had in the Electoral Count Act. When push comes to shove, people are going to try and find those blind spots. And so that's what we saw January 6th, 2021, was kind of this attempt to use the Electoral Count Act to the advantage, particularly of the Trump campaign. And I say all of that, and yet I think there would still be those that would say that's an act of Congress, right? It's not the Constitution. And the Constitution gives states the plenary power to determine how their electors are chosen. And so I think even then there would still be a question as to the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Act, which then was replaced because by the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022.
And to drill down a little bit on that, I guess famously the pro-Trump forces on January 6th were trying to persuade Vice President Mike Pence to decertify electors that were crucial to Biden's victory. And the Reform Act, I guess, makes it clear that the vice president really doesn't have much discretion there.
Right. In advance of that, Trump was making claims that there were irregularities in certain states. And so he actually called upon, so prior to the Electoral College meeting, Trump called upon some state legislatures and state legislators to say, hey, you have the power to appoint electors on your own if there were problems in your states. The Supreme Court in 2000, Bush v. Gore, essentially said, look, once the rules of the game are made, yes, state legislatures, they could dictate who their electors are, but it would need to be done, that legislation would need to be done before people are casting their ballots. So you can't do it after the fact. And so there was a little bit of that chicanery. And then you had Trump putting a full court press on Mike Pence to say, to either, reject those electoral college votes out of hand, or to say, I'm going to choose these votes over these votes. And Pence was not having any of it. If you were to go to the 12th Amendment, the vice president clearly does not have that authority, and the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022. And again, I should point out that was a bipartisan act. Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, passed this legislation within 2 years of the 2020 election. So they really did try and firm up those blind spots the Trump team exposed in that 2020 election.
In your book, you make the point that there have been some 800 efforts to reform the Electoral College or to improve the process of presidential elections. Out of all those proposals, what do you think are the best ideas?
So the Electoral College is one of the most maligned features of the United States Constitution, and it's been argued against by Democrats. It's been argued against by Republicans. It really is something that how you view it depends on where you stand. If you think you're advantaged by it, it's great. I mean, we saw Donald Trump actually tweet out in 2012, the Electoral College is a disaster for America. And then by 2016, he said it's beautiful for America. I mean, it really depends on where you stand, whether you think you're advantaged or disadvantaged. Currently, Democrats think that they may be disadvantaged by the Electoral College. And so there are a number of reforms that have been put forth. And I say all of that to kind of indicate that yet, while there is so much criticism, it's super reluctant to change. It's super resilient. There's been very few changes to the actual operation of the Electoral College since 1804 and the passage of the 12th Amendment. And so there's been efforts to say, why don't we just do an automatic awarding of 100 electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote? That would ensure that the popular vote winner would always win. That hasn't gained a lot of steam in recent years. There has been the idea to have an amendment to a direct popular vote. After the 1968 presidential election, where you had a third party split the vote and nobody nearing 50% on a very close popular vote margin, you had a huge movement among Democrats and Republicans to abolish the Electoral College in favor of a direct popular vote. And it was endorsed by Republicans like Gerald Ford. I mean, not only endorsed, they voted to pass that legislation. Gerald Ford, George H.W. Bush, Richard Nixon supported it as well. It had overwhelming support in the House and in the Senate. Over 30 states also said that they would be willing to pass it. Public opinion was decidedly in favor of a direct popular vote. It died in filibuster in the United States Senate by several Southern senators. And so the idea of amending the Constitution to change the Electoral College, very, very high threshold, very difficult to do. So there's been this other means to say, well, let's have this National Popular Vote Compact. And this compact has gained quite a bit of momentum in recent years. And essentially it says, states, we can join together and we will agree that we will cast our votes as a state for the winner of the national popular vote. Even if they don't win in our state, if they win the national popular vote, we're going to cast our Electoral College votes for that candidate. And it can only go into effect once members in that compact have 270 Electoral College votes. When I started studying the Electoral College, they've gained 70, 80 members, Electoral College votes. There are over 200 Electoral College votes in this compact now. I will say most of them are blue states. So kind of taking them to that 270 threshold, I think will be a tall order for them. There has been Republican support for the compact along with Democratic support. There are questions as to its constitutionality. I think that it would probably create quite a bit of tumult if indeed it were to try to be enacted. I think that states can also opt out of the compact based upon, the changing whims of a state legislature. So I don't know whether that's a long-term fix. Kind of turning back to that amendment idea, in 2000, we had a Republican win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote. In 2004, had 1% to 2% of Ohioans voted for John Kerry over George W. Bush, Kerry would have won the presidency with 271 Electoral College votes, but would have lost the popular vote. So we would have had back-to-back elections where each party would have been burned by the Electoral College. Had that happened, I think we would have seen a lot more momentum to change the Electoral College. And at the outset, you kind of point out that there's a pretty significant possibility in this election that we might find, let's say, Kamala Harris winning the popular vote but losing in the Electoral College, which would be the third time since 2000 that would have happened. But it's kind of like a shoulder shrug. Like, people aren't even concerned about it anymore. I find in the research that I've done that not winning that popular vote, it's the rules of the game, yes, but it creates a certain lack of legitimacy at the outset. You are already facing a crisis of sorts as a president when a plurality of folks did not vote for you. So if you take a look back at those presidents that came into power as a result of a misfire election, they tend to do very poorly in the eyes of history. Whether that's tied to the way they came into office or other events around that, I think is for historians to debate, but there's a pretty clear relationship that you see with that. So there are some of those ideas that are out there, and there are others that are looking at things like, should we go the Maine, Nebraska route and have district representation in our states so that we can become more visible in a presidential election? Then there's my idea to say, let's just at least eliminate faithless electors. So there's some smaller things that could be done, but big change around the Electoral College, I think, would require big issues or problems around the Electoral College.
Thank you, Rob. This has really been a terrific discussion. I don't want to leave it, though, without talking about one other thing you mentioned in your book, which was you acknowledge that this book was written with Radiohead, Weezer, Cake, and the Foo Fighters in the background.
This is true. My wife doesn't understand how I can write and listen to music at the same time, but that was on repeat. Now I'm into a Jason Isbell. So the next book, Jason Isbell, will be in the dedications.
Okay. Well, I'm with you on the idea of listening to music while writing. I find it works very well. Once again, you have such an amazing grasp of this topic and communicate it so well. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure, real honor.
That's a wrap for my conversation with Robert Alexander. I hope you found this deep dive into the mechanics of the Electoral College informative. As Rob said, the system that determines the winner of the presidential election is like a nagging injury that you learn to live with. But if people are going to have faith in the system, they have to view it as fair and legitimate, and some changes may well be needed to make that happen. At the very least, in looking at this year's election and beyond, we should never forget the way that presidents are actually chosen. As playwright Tom Stoppard once wrote, "It's not the voting that's democracy, it's the counting." And now, the answers to our quiz, based on recent posts at www.nowitshistory.com. Question 1. The movie Civil War imagines that Texas and California are the two states who unite to challenge a dictatorial U.S. president. Question 2. Following the 1860 vote, President-elect Abraham Lincoln feared that there would be an attempt to disrupt the certification of his victory by Congress. In fact, such an event didn't happen until our own time, on January 6, 2021. And the third question, wind and solar power are pushing wholesale electricity prices to zero in the Netherlands, Finland, and Spain. Our next episode is a chat with the author of a fascinating biography of John Hancock. You'll find out why he signed his name so boldly on the Constitution, but even more interesting is the often overlooked role that he played in Boston in setting the stage for the American Revolution. Thank you for listening. Please share this episode with others who might be interested. The show relies on listener support. Subscribe to the podcast, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or give us a rating on Spotify if you enjoyed the show. Sign up to get regular updates about all of our content at www.nowitshistory.com. Thanks again for joining me, and I want to give a special shout out to Jason Sanderson for his editing work on this episode. We'll see you on the next page.